Good day. Today is Tuesday, 31st March 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you watch this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, over the last 24 hours, we had a whole succession of extraordinary statements coming either directly from the President of the United States or mediated for us, filtered for us by parts of the US media, all of which reinforce the impression which I and many others have, and which is set out in a title that appears this morning in an article in the Daily Telegraph, the British newspaper, which, by the way, before the start of the armed conflict with Iran, never failed to agitate and insist upon and demand that attack on Iran, which on the 28th of February, in fact, happened. Anyway, that title reads that President Trump, has now lost control of the situation in the conflict. World recession warning as Trump loses control of Iran war. And the expression, the comment about losing control, ominously perhaps for the president, for Donald Trump, seems to originate in a report provided by some British financial institution. So we're starting to see opinion in the markets start to harden, or at least we see the first signs of this, that the President of the United States is losing control of the war. For a president, for a US president involved in a war, that is the most disastrous position he can be in. Previous presidents who found themselves in exactly that kind of position were George W. Bush over Iraq, and of course, more importantly, more damagingly still, Lyndon Johnson back in the 1960s over the conflict in Vietnam. And this goes directly to a comment made in a program which we were fortunate to do with him on the Duran, with Jim Webb, to be precise, former US military officer, national security advisor to Robert Kennedy Jr. when Robert Kennedy Jr. was a presidential candidate, somebody who repeatedly and constantly writes insightfully about the conflict, the military situation, both in Iran and, by the way, in the conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, over the course of that program, which we did with him on the Duran, Jim Webb said that the United States has lost the military initiative in the conflict with Iran, and, well, the financial community are beginning to say this to themselves, and of course this is inevitably going to have an impact on the developing situation in the financial markets and in the markets generally, and that also is going to shape the direction of the war. Anyway, Trump himself, as I said, has been issuing all sorts of extraordinary statements. So yesterday he made another one of his truly extraordinary Truth Social posts. He said that he expects, he is in contact with and in negotiations with a much more reasonable, much more rational, much more amenable alternative Iranian government, and that he confidently expects to do a deal with them. But if this deal is not done, well, fire and thunder will be unleashed on Iran. All its energy facilities, its desalination plants will be destroyed. Harg Island also will be destroyed. Its energy industry will be destroyed. To me, I have to say, it looked again like a statement that gave the opposite message to the one that Donald Trump perhaps thought he was making. I don't believe that this alternative, more reasonable government, or what Donald Trump would judge a more reasonable government, exists in Iran, either in fact or in waiting. I think the only government in Iran is the one that holds power in Iran today. When Donald Trump talks about his desire, the fact that he is in discussions with this alternative government, and that he expects a satisfactory agreement to be made with them, what Trump is actually doing is that he's pleading with the existing government of Iran to sit down and negotiate with him and to give him some kind of off-ramp. That, I am sure, is the conclusion that the Iranians themselves will be making. They, of course, read all of these comments that Donald Trump puts out. They know far better than he does what the actual situation within their country is. They will see this message, they will know that there is no alternative government, and they will see this talk about negotiations as a plea from the President of the United States addressed to them to agree to negotiate with him. And as for the extraordinary threats that President Trump is making, the Iranians will conclude that it is all a bluff. They have seen the attacks that the United States has already made upon them. They know perfectly well the size and resources of their country. They will undoubtedly be well informed about the various capabilities that the United States actually has in the region. They can read the American media and newspapers just as well as all of us can do. And of course, if they aren't reading those newspapers and aren't seeing there all of the reports about dwindling US military inventories, about reductions in availability of precision-guided weapons and all of those things, their friends, the Chinese and the Russians, will be telling them all about it. So the Iranians, reading this extraordinary message, will conclude that they are winning, that the United States, or at least the administration, is losing, and that they will see this message as a sign of weakness, and they will respond accordingly. And one of the ways in which they will respond is by declining to give Donald Trump what he is pleading for, the negotiations he is asking for, because inevitably, after a message like this, the Iranians will say to themselves, well, we have the Americans on the run, we have Trump on the run, let us keep doing what we are doing, keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed, preventing ships with oil products and other products from the Persian Gulf area. Leave the Persian Gulf. Let us wait until energy prices get even higher before the fears and worries about a global recession grow even greater. Let's go on pounding the Israelis, and let's go on pounding all of those American bases, because our strategy is succeeding, and if we persist with it, then in a week's time, when all of the threats and all of the bluffs have fallen away, if the Americans still want to talk, we will be in an even stronger position than the one we are in now. I don't know who is advising Trump, but I can say with absolute certainty that that is how the Iranians, and not just the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, people across the Middle East will be reading this extraordinary Truth Social post. They will be reading it in exactly the way that I have just said. And of course, the Iranians will be reading also the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Donald Trump has told his officials, he's apparently had some kind of discussions with his officials, and far from escalating, far from doing all the terrifying things that he warns about in his Truth Social post, the reality, at least what he's telling his officials, is completely different. What he's actually going to do is he's going to go on hitting Iran for a further 2 weeks, inflicting as much damage on Iran as he possibly can. He's going to talk about the destruction of Iran's ballistic missiles, its launchers, its air defense missiles, all of these things. He's going to pretend that he is achieving, and the United States is achieving, more results than it really is. After all, who in the West keeps inventories of Iranian weapons systems? So if Donald Trump comes out in 2 weeks' time and says that 99% of Iran's missiles have been destroyed, who in the West can actually conclusively, factually contradict him? Just saying. So Trump is going to do all of that. He's going to, as I said, go on hammering Iran at much the same level that he is doing, that the United States is doing at the moment. And then at the end of that 2-week period, he's going to declare victory and he's going to stop the war. In other words, he's going to end the US's direct military involvement in the war. And, well, as for the Strait of Hormuz, apparently what he said to his officials is that that can remain closed. The United States is self-sufficient in energy products. The United States is not, therefore, directly affected by the Strait of Hormuz. Others are. It's the Europeans and the Japanese, those who have failed to come to America's help. It is for them, not for the United States, not for Donald Trump, to come along and sort out the problem in the Strait of Hormuz, to try to get it open and to try to get the energy exported from the Persian Gulf again. And, well, we've seen a follow-up to the president's words from some of his officials. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in far more elegant language, has essentially been saying, or so it seems to me, much the same thing. No longer is it spoken about as a war to change the governmental system in Iran. It's no longer being presented as a regime change war. It was at the very start, but Senate Secretary Rubio, other US officials, even the president aren't talking about it in quite that way anymore. So focus, according to Secretary Rubio, on military objectives where, as I said, it's difficult for others to flatly contradict you. Focus on military objectives, declare victory, say that, of course, it's unacceptable for the Strait of Hormuz to remain indefinitely closed. That's not something that the Iranians can be permitted to do. But then, of course, hint that that's something that others, not the United States, the Europeans, the Persian Gulf states, the Asians, they need to be the ones that come along and sort out that problem. And, well, over the last couple of hours, we've had the president saying more things in that sort of direction. He says that it's for the Europeans, for the British, for others who are short of oil. It's for them to find oil where they can. It's not for the United States to sort out their problems in the Persian Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States is self-sufficient in all of these things. They are not. This is their problem, not America's. They didn't join the battle. There's no need, therefore, for the United States to pull the coals out of the fire for them to resolve the problem of the Strait of Hormuz. They can do it. They can do it by themselves. In the meantime, it's up to them to find the oil, whatever oil they need, from wherever they can. Now, these are not sustainable policies. If Donald Trump believes that in 2 or 3 weeks' time he can simply walk away from this and pull all the US troops and all of the ships and warships out of the Middle East and leave the situation essentially unresolved, with the Iranian government still in control of Iran, still in control of the Strait of Hormuz, then I'm afraid he is living in the world of illusions. If such a thing were ever done, America's Middle East allies, the Persian Gulf states, the Israelis, and America's Asian and European allies would all feel abandoned. They would feel that the United States has abandoned and, in some sense, betrayed them. This would be particularly true, of course, of Israel, which has been agitating for a war against Iran for pretty much as long as I can remember, and which clearly has seen this war and the US's involvement in this war as a means to its goal, which is clearly and indisputably either regime change in Iran or, failing that, the complete collapse of Iran. And of course, even worse would be the position of the Persian Gulf states. Now here I believe that they have been playing a very complex and, in my opinion, duplicitous game. Back in 2023, Saudi Arabia, using the good offices provided by China, seemed to effect a reconciliation with Iran. At the time, I took that seriously. I thought this was for real, and I discussed in many places, as did we on the Duran, how this appeared to represent a diplomatic revolution. Well, I have to say that I no longer believe, this is my own view, but I no longer believe that that apparent reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran was made in good faith. Looking back, it seems to me that the Saudis went ahead with it because Joe Biden was in the White House. This was 2023. Joe Biden and the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, detested each other. MBS felt bitterly betrayed by Obama and Biden over the Khashoggi affair, a fact that has rankled ever since. And MBS basically no longer believed that the United States would conduct the military campaign against Iran that the Saudis wanted. In fact, as I very well remember, the Saudis were already unhappy about the fact that there had been missile strikes on their country by the Houthis in Yemen, on their oil facilities, and they'd felt let down by the Obama administration as a result of its failure to protect those facilities. But then last year, Donald Trump came back. He was known to be very, very sympathetic and friendly to the Saudis, to MBS himself, and he was known to be very, very hostile to Iran. So this was the opportunity to reel back to the original policy that the Saudis had had for many years, which is of intense hostility to Iran and of supporting action intended to change the political system there. In fact, I remember that before the reconciliation, the apparent reconciliation with Iran, MBS himself had been particularly outspoken, even by Saudi standards, in the things that he had been saying about Iran and about the Iranian leadership. So, far from the Saudis being a factor for restraint in this war, I believe that they did, in fact, encourage it, that all of those reports about MBS urging Trump on to attack Iran were true. And for the record, I believe that MBS was not alone in this. I think some of the other Persian Gulf producers, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, who knows which, were busy urging Trump to begin this conflict as well, without in any way downplaying the role of Israel in encouraging this war. I think the encouragement to Donald Trump to launch this war that was probably coming from the Persian Gulf producers is something that should not be understated. I think, on the contrary, that it probably played a significant role in persuading Donald Trump and the officials around him to launch this war in the first place. Well, if Donald Trump now does what the Wall Street Journal says he's thinking of doing, if he pulls his warships and his aircraft and his troops from the Middle East and declares victory and says that he successfully prevented the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapons capability and that he's destroyed all of their ballistic missiles, and just walks away and leaves the Saudis and the Persian Gulf producers up against a hostile and furious and undefeated and actually very powerful Iran by themselves. Well, I think the feelings of betrayal and anger amongst these Persian Gulf producers will not be difficult to imagine. And though you could argue, and by the way, I would argue, based on my previous analysis, that they have brought it entirely upon themselves and are getting no more than what they deserve, well, still, after such a debacle, assuming they even survive it, they will not want to trust the United States in the same way again. So there's that to think about in the Middle East, the attitudes of America's Arab allies. There's the situation with Israelis who will feel that Trump led them into a war, or perhaps it was the Israelis who led him into a war, but he didn't hold back. He didn't step back from agreeing to it. Anyway, the Israelis will also feel very angry. And of course, the Europeans will feel abandoned. And here we come back to the basic issue about energy prices. Because if the United States simply pulls out of this conflict, leaving the Strait of Hormuz closed, then inevitably what is going to happen is that global energy costs will continue to rise. And inevitably, given the fungible nature of global energy prices, this is going to cause higher energy prices in the United States itself. I read this morning in the Financial Times that in some American gas stations, the price of gas is now $4 a gallon. So Trump, who is very sensitive to this, is in that kind of situation going to be even more concerned. I think any American president in his sort of situation would be even more concerned about that. And, well, the US oil reserves are being depleted by the day. And sooner or later, in some form or other, if the United States pulls out and the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, I think that inevitably Donald Trump, or indeed any US administration in his position, would be obliged to take the kind of measures that I remember President Carter taking in the early 1980s and prohibiting oil exports. And despite the talk there is about the United States having a big surplus of natural gas, I suspect gas exports, LNG exports as well. And that might, of course, stabilize prices, energy prices in the United States, but of course it will leave the rest of the world in an even deeper crisis, and it will ensure that energy prices around the world rise even further, with all of the economic effects that flow from that. So at some point, the people around Donald Trump are going to explain all of this to him. And if he even actually is entertaining the plan of simply walking away from this conflict in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I am sure sooner or later, in some form or other, he's going to be made to understand that it simply can't be done. As Colin Powell is supposed to have told George W. Bush over the conflict in Iraq, you broke it, you own it. And that is the situation that Donald Trump is going to be in. It seems to me that he has only two available courses before him. The very bad one, which is to go on escalating the war, to do the various things that people have been talking about, seize islands in the Strait of Hormuz, or perhaps Kharg Island. I've discussed in many places how, to me, this looks like a trap. Professor John Mearsheimer, by the way, who has on his Substack site another indispensable place to go to get a clear picture of the situation in the world and of the evolving diplomacy. Anyway, Professor Mearsheimer, who, by the way, knows a great deal more about military affairs than me, he's been following and observing them for, well, longer than I have done, and I believe he's had a military background as well, by the way. Anyway, Professor Mearsheimer says that to him, this looks like a kamikaze mission. And, well, that goes back to what Jim Webb was saying on the Duran in the program that we did with him yesterday. And, well, Jim Webb is a military person, and I've seen what Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has been saying, and I've been seeing what other military people have been saying. Joe Kent has talked about any US troops who occupy these islands on the Persian Gulf becoming, in effect, hostages of the Iranians. Dramatic language. But again, here's a person with a storied background. I mean, he's somebody who's received, I think it was 11 decorations for gallantry in combat. He's certainly somebody who understands military affairs and could see this, the way this thing could shape out. Anyway, to me, this military operation, as I discussed yesterday, and all of these other people that I've spoken about, Professor Mearsheimer, Colonel Davis, Joe Kent, Jim Webb, they all say the same thing. This, again, to use the title of the article on Professor Mearsheimer's Substack site, this looks like a suicide. This is a kind of kamikaze mission in the Gulf. It is setting up the United States for an even bigger military debacle with geopolitical consequences that would be dramatic, to say the least. And of course, we must never, ever overlook the consequences for the lives of the soldiers and the families of those soldiers, and of course also for the losses, the enormous human losses in Iran itself. So that is one option that President Trump has to escalate. Disastrous option, in my opinion, or at least all the indications to be suggested. The other option is the option of seriously seeking talks, not with some fictitious, non-existent, imaginary, reasonable Iranian government, which does not exist, but with the actual Iranian government in Tehran, in Iran itself. They have negotiated with the United States in the past. Perhaps, despite everything, they can be persuaded again to do so. I don't think it is hopeless. I've said already that serious US negotiators wanting to sit down and talk to the Iranians, basically from first base, forget about all of these ultimatums about stopping nuclear enrichment, stopping production of ballistic missiles. I was dismayed to see that Secretary Rubio was talking about all of that again. Bringing up all of those things is going to disincentivize the Iranians from agreeing to negotiate at all. They will say, what's the point if all that we are going to talk to the Americans about is all of these proposals that we have repeatedly rejected because they are so unacceptable to us? What is the point of us sitting down with the Americans at all? Anyway, the Americans need to stop talking about these things. They need to tell the Iranians, look, we are in this situation. You cannot want this war to continue indefinitely. You may be doing well at the moment, but war is unpredictable. It is high risk. Your people are dying. Your economy is under enormous stress. Your allies, your Chinese and Russian allies, well, you don't fully trust them and they don't fully trust you. You need to come to a resolution, a final resolution with us. We are prepared to talk. We are prepared to talk without conditions and from a clear sheet of paper, a clean sheet of paper, and we need to discuss with you. We are willing to discuss with you the way forward towards some sort of long-term accommodation. The United States could propose that. It could propose that through the Pakistanis, obviously. But as I've said already, it would be much more meaningful. It would make far better sense to do so using the good offices of those countries, China and Russia, which in this situation do have leverage, potential leverage over Iran. Now, I discussed 2 days ago how China is now giving its first signs that it wants to see the conflict end. And that is clearly a message to the United States, which it blames for starting the conflict in the first place. But it's also a message from China to Iran that China does not want the war to drag on. So the Chinese, if asked, if the Americans come with some serious proposal for serious negotiations with serious negotiators, not with Witkoff and Kushner, but with Vance and Rubio and others, real experts and people of that kind, the Chinese probably would be willing to take steps to facilitate that. The Pakistanis are also saying that China is backing moves towards mediation and a settlement of the conflict. And yesterday, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said the same thing. Firstly, Lavrov said that the situation is deteriorating. And he said this, by the way, over the course of a presentation that he was making to another Russian foreign policy think tank. But he said this, he said, what we are witnessing now shows signs of escalating into an increasingly large-scale conflict, which some have already dubbed the New World War. Again, Lavrov talking about a new world war. That is how dramatic he sees the situation. And then Lavrov continues, Russia advocates the return of the US-Israeli conflict with Iran to a diplomatic track. Moscow is ready to provide mediation and other assistance to resolve the crisis in the Persian Gulf through diplomatic means. And Lavrov also criticized indirectly the Persian Gulf states and the United States and the Israelis in connection with their attempts to get the Persian Gulf states involved in the war. Lavrov said this: the United States and Israel are trying to prevent normalization between Iran and its neighbors, and even to incite the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council against the Islamic Republic. And Lavrov went on to say that Western countries have come in clinch with the nations of the global majority that seek to overcome the inequality born out of the West's irrepressible hegemonic ambitions. To me, that all looks like advice by the Russians to the Persian Gulf states, telling them, stop listening to whatever urging you get from the Americans and the Israelis to involve yourselves more deeply in this war. You have made a critical mistake. You yourselves played a role in bringing this war about. You see the consequences. Let us help you finally and fully to resolve these issues with Iran. We are prepared to act as mediators. We're prepared to act as mediators between the Iranians on the one side and the Americans and the Israelis on the other. Though I should say, I doubt that the Russians now have much confidence or trust in the Israelis anymore. The Russians have repeatedly pointed out that back in December, they thought they'd negotiated an agreement between Iran and Israel, that those two countries would never attack each other. And as the Russians have complained on many occasions since the start of the war on the 28th of February, that was clearly a deception on the Israeli part. But the Russians, worried about the escalation, talking about a potential new world war, about a crisis that is spiraling out of control, exactly the same warnings that the Chinese were making in that Global Times editorial that I discussed 2 programs ago. Anyway, the Russians are saying that despite all this history of bad faith, they are prepared to act as mediators. They understand, they see how dangerous this situation potentially is. And if the Americans and the Persian Gulf states want to end this war, the Russians are there and they will help, and they will do, as the Chinese have said, are saying they will do, whatever they can to get the parties talking to each other again. Now, the Russians do have significant leverage over the Iranians, probably more at this time than the Chinese do. The Russians have been sending supplies of what they call humanitarian goods to Iran, food, other products to keep the Iranian economy at least functioning. I think that there is now an all but universal consensus that the Russians are providing significant intelligence and military aid to Iran, all the facts point in that direction. And well, there might be others preparing to become involved as well. Others coming to Iran's help, potentially from Russia. I read in the Iranian media this morning this rather astonishing article. Chechen units ready to deploy to Iran in the event of US ground invasion. Chechen military units have announced their readiness to deploy to Iran to support the Iranian armed forces in the event of a ground invasion, according to reports. Forces loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Russia's Chechen Republic, described the ongoing American-Israeli war against the Islamic Republic of Iran as a religious war. They described their possible direct intervention as a jihad, a battle of good versus evil in defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran against American and Allied forces. Now, I must say straight away that this is a report which I have seen in the Iranian media. I've checked the Russian media. I can find no trace of it anywhere there. So the Iranians say that there has been this announcement from Chechen militia units loyal to Kadyrov. I haven't seen this announcement myself. The Iranians are saying that there have been reports about this announcement. They don't say where these reports are coming from. I haven't seen these reports myself. The Russian media isn't publishing them. But it's not impossible that these announcements and these reports have indeed been made, that they've been published in the Chechen media, in Chechnya itself. Given the tight integration which exists today between the Chechen government of Kadyrov and the militia units, Kadyrov himself is, I believe, a lieutenant general in the Russian National Guard, for example. I cannot imagine that any announcement of this kind, if it has been made, can have been made by the Chechen authorities or by the Chechen militias, which are, by the way, also in the main integrated in the Russian National Guard, without some kind of green light from Moscow. So, well, everybody acknowledges that the Chechens are formidable fighters. If you take this article in the Iranian media seriously, if the Americans are unwise enough to conduct the kamikaze mission of undertaking some kind of ground operation against Iran, well, they could find themselves up against not just the Iranians, some of whose forces, my impression is, are formidable in themselves, but perhaps against the Chechens as well. And of course, behind the Chechens, there would be the Russians. So, well, the Russians are there. They have both the mailed fist, if you like, but they're also extending the velvet glove. Lavrov is again talking about a new world war. Lavrov is talking about a situation which is escalating out of control. The Chinese, via Global Times, have been talking in the same way. It seems to me that the potential for a diplomatic resolution exists. What needs to be done is for the President of the United States to come to his senses, to authorize the right people to make the right contacts. I think that if the government in Tehran is informed that the Russians and the Chinese both want Iran to start negotiations with the Americans on the basis that I've said, on a clean sheet of paper, without conditions, with neither side making fantastic demands of the other. Though, for the record, I don't any longer believe that the original Iranian demand for the American bases in the Middle East, at least the ones close to Iran, to be dismantled. Well, I no longer believe that that is in fact an unreasonable or impossible demand. I think, on the contrary, it is something which the Iranians will, in the event that there is a negotiation, probably eventually insist on, and which the Americans, in their own interests, might want to concede. After all, in what sense have these American bases proved as a strategic asset for the United States? The United States has had to evacuate them. They've not been an asset. They've been a liability. They've been hammered by Iran. The Americans have had to abandon them. It seems to me that they're just a weight on America's shoulders. They haven't enhanced security in the Middle East. They haven't reassured anybody. They've just proved to be a problem for the United States, which it would want to be rid of. But anyway, coming back to my point, a proper negotiation in some neutral capital, Islamabad, Kuala Lumpur, wherever, I think if the Iranians were told that that's what's on offer, a negotiation in which the Americans are represented by, well, more serious people, by the Vice President and the Secretary of State, not by Witkoff and Kushner, well, I think at that point it would happen, and it would indeed calm global markets, and it might eventually result in something being achieved. Moreover, I think that it should not be that difficult for the United States and Iran to come to some kind of serious long-term understanding with each other. The US has now seen the extent of Iranian power, the ability that Iran has to shut the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is clearly not a country whose regime can be overthrown. At the same time, Iran doesn't want to be in a state of permanent war. Iran and the United States are both agreed up to now that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. If one approaches this rationally, something which I admit has been in very short supply, then I myself cannot see why an agreement cannot be reached. But of course, things are not rational. Trust hardly exists, and the president has to make that move, and at the moment he shows no sign of doing so. And, well, given that that is so, it seems to me far more likely that we're going to see that kamikaze mission that Professor Mearsheimer talk about materialize, that disastrous escalation, perhaps the Chechens will indeed at that point become involved. Perhaps we will indeed see American troops trapped on islands or facing all kinds of problems on the ground in Iran itself. I repeat all the things that I said in my program yesterday about how the United States in these operations would not have secure control over the sky for the first time since perhaps the fighting in Tunisia in 1943. Anyway, and of course, if we do have that escalation, if things do start to spiral out of control, Donald Trump, in that disastrous Truth Social post that I discussed at the start of this program, talked about attacking Iranian desalination plants. Iranian desalination plants produce around 2% of Iran's fresh water. It is America's allies, the Persian Gulf states and Israel, that depend far more heavily on desalination plants. But if the Americans attack Iranian desalination plants, likely the Iranians will attack other desalination plants across the Middle East. We could quite quickly find ourselves in the biggest humanitarian crisis that we have perhaps seen since the end of the Second World War. On top of everything else, if there's further escalations and fighting on islands and on the ground in Iran itself, with all the terrible consequences that I've said, well, the Iranian parliament is apparently already debating proposed legislation to pull Iran out of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. The Iranians are telling everybody that this does not mean that Iran has made a decision to press forward with nuclear weapons. But the reality is, if Iran does indeed pull out of the treaty, then it will give every appearance of being intended to provide the pathway towards eventual nuclear weapons possession. That is exactly what North Korea did. They first pulled out of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and then they went ahead and developed the existing nuclear weapons arsenal that they currently have. So if the North Koreans did that, if the Iranians appear to be following the same course, then everybody's going to assume that the Iranians are going to go nuclear at some point, probably some point soon. So in this huge crisis, this huge potential crisis, with all of these things either happening or possibly happening, well, we can understand why someone like Lavrov is increasingly talking about a potential world war. And when Lavrov is talking in that way, it seems to me that he's clearly hinting at the possible use of the ultimate weapon system. Maybe not by the United States, but perhaps by Israel. And there's been much talk about this. People like, I haven't seen them say it myself, but I believe that both Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and Colonel Douglas McGregor have floated this possibility. Well, to repeat again, if we find ourselves in that kind of scenario, well, we are in a completely different world from the one we have been living in since the end of the Second World War. And I would have thought a far more dangerous one. And when Lavrov is talking about a potential new world war, it seems to me that he is ringing alarm bells because the Russians are worried about exactly this sort of thing. And based on what they're saying, it seems to me that the Chinese are worrying about it too. So, surely, in light of all of this, that diplomatic outreach that I spoke about by the United States is the way forward. The Iranians won't do it themselves. They realize that if they did, it would be treated in the United States by Trump and his officials, the officials that led him into this war, as a sign of weakness. So the Iranians are going to wait for the Americans to do it. And I think the Americans should do it, and should do it now, before their situation gets weaker still, and before the overall situation starts to become far more dangerous, as it has every potential of becoming. Does the president understand this? Will he come to his senses? Are the people advising him? I'm afraid I don't have the answers to those questions. I am very worried, extremely worried, that the probable answer is no. I hope that it is otherwise. Well, we will just have to wait and see. In the meantime, that other war, the war in Ukraine, continues. And on that topic, I read a very interesting discussion by an institute in Kiev, which looks at the conditions of the Russian economy. And I think they provided a far more realistic assessment of the financial benefits that the Russians are going to get from the higher oil prices. They estimate that the higher oil prices will increase receipts for the Russians by $750 million a month. In other words, the Russians are going to receive around $750 million every month that oil prices remain at the current level, over and above what they were receiving before. And of course, if oil prices rise still further over the course of the summer, as they may very well do, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, then I can see how the Russians could end up making much more money than that. Tens of billions of dollars, more than enough to make up the deficit in their budget from 2025 and to cover their budget for this year as well. Just saying. Anyway, in the meantime, we are getting quite a lot of reports from the battlefronts. I've discussed how it looks as if the situation in Kupiansk, on the east bank of the Oskol River, has been resolved, that the Ukrainian cauldron there, the cauldron of the Ukrainian troops there, has collapsed. There's been more footage from Konstantinovka, which further confirms Russian operations in the built-up area and the industrial area in the center of Konstantinovka. There are now more indications that the Russians are pressing towards the town of Orekhov in Zaporozhye region. Now, that's the most interesting piece of information of all, is that the Russians seem to be moving quite fast now towards the town of Sumy, the city of Sumy in Sumy region. They recently, a few months ago, a few weeks ago, the Russian general in this area, General Nikiforov, said that his troops were located 20 kilometers from Sumy, the city of Sumy. It seems to me that they are much closer to Sumy now. Perhaps 10, 15, 11 kilometers, I'm not sure. I'm never good with maps. But they are getting closer to Sumy all the time. And I get the sense that Ukrainian defenses in this area are very weak. I wonder whether, along with Zaporozhye region and Donbass, the summer offensive, the Russian summer offensive, will include an operation against the city of Sumy as well, in which case, if Sumy, the city of Sumy, falls, the road to Kiev will lie open. Just saying. Anyway, that's the military situation. But perhaps I will now touch on something else which has attracted a certain amount of attention. I discussed about 2 weeks ago, how the Russians were sending oil to Cuba, a Russian oil tanker, government-owned Russian oil tanker, with 730,000 barrels of oil, crude oil, was steaming towards Cuba. And another ship, apparently rather modern ship, with some kind of advanced energy product, I'm not sure what it was, the Seahorse, was also supposedly steaming towards Cuba from Russia with these products as well. Now, the tanker, the government-owned tanker, has docked in Cuba. There was lots of speculation about whether the United States would try to prevent it reaching Cuba. I said in programs that I thought that the United States was unlikely to interfere with this tanker, and so it has proved. About the Seahorse, the other ship, well, there is a lot less reporting about it in the West, but I will say that in the Russian media, at least, they're claiming that the Seahorse actually reached Cuba in early March and has already unloaded its cargo and has engaged in complex maneuvers and spoofing to keep the US uncertain as to its exact whereabouts. I'm very skeptical about those claims, by the way. I think the Americans know perfectly well what has happened to the Seahorse. But anyway, that was what happened, and that ship also reached Cuba and has unloaded its cargo. So the Cubans have now received a significant delivery for free of oil and probably other products, energy products from Russia. At normal levels of consumption, that would be enough to carry Cuba through a further month. But of course, the Cubans can husband what they've received, and perhaps they can stretch it out for several weeks, beyond that, for several weeks more, until late spring, early summer. Just saying. Now, that brings me back to this overall situation. This is only an interim solution for Cuba's problems. Cuba continues to be in a condition of acute crisis. It has to decide what it should do. Its over-dependence on Venezuelan oil has now been exposed. There's some reports about Mexican oil deliveries to Cuba as well, but we'll see whether they materialize. But of course, the big problem that the Cubans have anyway is that they cannot pay for regular oil deliveries. The Cubans, it seems to me, now have a choice. Either they use this period that the Russians have bought for them to try to negotiate a better deal with the Americans, which, by the way, is what I think many people in Cuba would prefer, or now that they have seen that despite all of the bluster, the United States does not want to prevent transfers of oil from Russia to Cuba. President Trump says that the Americans allowed this tanker to get through, but that he doesn't really object to oil reaching Cuba from other places. But the reality is, as I've said in the past, that the United States will not want to tangle with the Russians, especially at this time, over oil trade on the high seas. There's the worry about what the Russian Navy might do, but there's also the further worry of what that might do to energy prices at a time when they're already skyrocketing because of the crisis in the Persian Gulf. So the Cubans can either use this time to try to negotiate a better deal with the Americans, or they can finally decide that they have no real choice, no realistic choice, but to go with the Russians and with the Chinese, who, by the way, are also busy supplying Cuba with solar panels and batteries and all of those things, and who have spoken in the past about helping Cuba to electrify its economy. Now, the thing to say is that the Russians will not provide oil to Cuba for free. The days when the Soviet Union used to do that are gone, and are gone forever. If the Cubans decide to go with the Russians, and perhaps the Chinese too, there will be a price, there will be a deal to be done. The Russians will have interests in Cuba, in the Cuban economy, which they've discussed in the past. They will want to see changes in the way in which Cuba runs its affairs. They will want access to the Cuban tourist industry, to the Cuban nickel